Starting? Yes. Okay.
Yep, we can start.
Excellent. Okay, so good morning, folks. Welcome. And first of all, welcome back to Matt. We loved
I
having
know that's why everybody's here today, is to see me.
Matt with a haircut. We loved having Grace here, and we love having Matt back. Today, as advertised, I'm going to be talking about Hamilton the man, Hamilton the musical, and then something about what that tells us about history and how we understand our own history. But before I do that, as ever, I will turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game as to how, after my comments, people can ask questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So rules for today is, as always, please feel free to use chat to have a conversation. Germane to what we're talking about, please. We already had one Zoom bomber. Let's try to avoid having a second. And but looking forward to those comments. We'd love seeing those comments in chat. If you do have a question, make sure you put it in the Q&A section. That's where we take questions from. So try to remember, not in chat, but in Q&A, and we'll get to the questions here in a few minutes after Joanne's done talking. And as always, if you enjoy our programming here at the National Council for History Education, please join us at www.nche.net and become a member, get all of our great stuff, and follow us on Twitter at HistoryEd. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
I know, let's take away our show. Okay.
Let's take away our show. Give me 1 second and I'll make you the spotlight so nobody has to look at me.
While you were doing that, there we go. Okay. I will say, I think, I believe I saw Matt say on Twitter that this is number 13, our 13th History
13,
Matt.
yes.
It is 13. Okay, so it is lucky 13. I had a great aunt who once told me that 13 was my lucky number, so this is all good. So this is our 13th. For those of you who are new, all the past ones are archived online at nche.net/conversations. That also makes me feel very high tech. Okay, but let's get into today's subject. I didn't this week. Normally, again, for those who are new, I include a document, and I realized as I was thinking about what I was going to say today, I should have linked things to an article I wrote a couple of years ago for Slate about Hamilton and history, and I will give that link to Matt after this morning so that if you want to go back and find it, you could Google it too, but if you want to go back and find it, you can do that. But at any rate, no document, because in a way the play is the document for the week. And so what I'm going to do this morning, as I've suggested, I'm going to talk about Hamilton for a little bit and who he was and some of the ways in which we can think about him that I think probably most people who are new to him don't, since they're learning of him mostly, I think, from the play. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the play and what it does wonderfully and what isn't there. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what all that means, because we're in a moment right now, and this is not a surprise in any way. History is, I'm not going to say history is happening, and yet I just said it. History is front and center because we're confronting in so many ways what we are as a nation and who we are as a nation, and that's bound up with what we've done as a nation. So this, although it's talking about a play that came out many years ago, history is always topical, and it's really topical now. There's a reason why I think a lot of historians now are really engaging with the public, because we all understand the importance of this conversation. Okay, now Hamilton happens to be the founder of the moment, and that is obviously because of the play. What I'm about to say could be said about any number of other people, particularly men from this time period, but they are also true of Hamilton. So reasons why at this particular moment he feels a little topical. Number one, he's a revolutionary, right? He engaged in a revolution. We are in a moment when in one way or another revolutionary things are happening. So in a sense, some of the ideas bound up with him and his cohort are connected in some ways with the spirit or the mood or the ideas or the impact of what we're going through now. And he's also obviously a founder with a capital F at a time when some pretty foundational ideas and structures are being tested and evaluated. As I said, you could say that about a lot of other people. Hamilton is the guy who has the spotlight on him because of the play, but I think both of those things matter, right? He's a revolutionary, he's a founder, and in this moment, we're once again potentially reckoning with him in some way. And I suppose in a way, the sub-theme of what I'm going to be talking about today is complexity. I think, and you'll hear as I make my comments, I think when we generally think about history, when we think about the nation's history, or people from the past, we make narratives. There's a reason why the word story is part of history. Many people tend to simplify or strip away things from the past in favor of either what they believe to be true or what they want to be true. This is an idea I'm going to come back to at the end, but that's also true having to do just with the simple understanding of a person like Hamilton. I think because he's a founder, and for some people that's like a golden halo, right? It means they are a founder, they are a noble person and can't be questioned in any way. I think that's wrong. I think one of the reasons I do what I do is particularly because of the complexity, because these people were flawed. They had bad ideas. They instituted some bad things in addition to some very worthy ideals that they maybe did or didn't meet. But it's the complexity and the flaws that make up the human story of what happened in the past. So in the case of Hamilton, here's some of the complexity that it might be easy to overlook. So on the one hand, I started out by saying he's a revolutionary, which he was, but in a way, he's a bit of a conservative revolutionary, right? He was very law and order. He was very worried about property rights. He says at one point during the revolution, I'm not going to get the quote absolutely right because I didn't look it up before this, but he says in a letter, I think maybe to John Jay, something like, I am more or less dislike anything done out of mere whim. It's like, I like things to be done deliberately. Like, I don't like some of this revolutionary uproar. I'm not really excited about it. So he is revolutionary. He's fervently a believer in the things that the revolution represents. And he's a little bit of a conservative revolutionary, right? I think that's not necessarily an oxymoron that has no meaning. I think it has some meaning, and I think that suits him. But again, that's complexity that we don't often bring into the picture when we think about him. Also, we tend to think of him, a lot of people when they write about him, as this forward-looking guy who, making modern America in some way, right? That he was looking to the future and his opponents were looking to the past. That's more complicated too, right? Because he very much was, his vision for the nation feels like what we assume modern America to be, right? So it's like city-oriented and industry and, military power and all of these things that we associate with, in some way or another, the United States. But those are also things that one could associate with great nation states and could have in his time associated with big, sort of empire/nations like England and France. So on the one hand, what he's doing feels like, or what he wanted to do, his vision feels like he was pushing to modernize the United States, but he was also looking to the old world as a model. So again, it's more complex. And the same could be true thinking about Jefferson as a slaveholder and suggesting that puts him absolutely in the past period. The one thing, not the one thing, but one thing you can say about Jefferson is that he had a more inclusive understanding of democracy. He was far more comfortable with the American people acting on the streets, explaining, demanding, protesting in a way that Jefferson, and he says this a lot, right? He thinks that's healthy for a nation to be able to engage in that kind of behavior, for the American people to be able to do that. Hamilton was not thrilled with that. And I guess it was maybe last week when I talked about the incident when he came up in front of a group of people and they threw rocks at his head and he said, "Men of order, follow me," which is another example of conservative kind of revolutionary. Hamilton wasn't comfortable with that kind of democracy. So even on that level, it's more complex than it might be. I wrote the Hamilton, the play, was, and I think still is, in London. And I wrote an essay for the program. And I felt like partly what I feel like now, which is when you step into the picture, particularly now, given who Hamilton seems to be to people who know the play, you end up feeling like you're stepping, like you're squashing every parade, right? I go into the program and I'm like, well, he wasn't that comfortable with a lot of democracy. Well, sort of, by introducing complexity in the case of Hamilton right now, that means introducing, in some cases, flaws, real problems. And so, I've been studying him for decades. I've been studying him since I was, 12 or 13 or 14 or something. I don't hate the guy. I think, like most people in history, the fact that he's human is the most important part of him, or the most interesting part of him, put it that way. But very often people who will come up to me and say, I'm too mean to Hamilton, right? That I'm not, I don't show gratitude to Hamilton for giving me a career. I think, actually I have had someone say that to me. I think the best thing one can do for history and for people in the past is to try and confront them on their own terms. And I think that's important to do. And I think that's part of what we're doing this morning. One other idea here I'll mention about Hamilton, and then we'll segue to the play. He was engaged with what at the time would have been called money men, right? All the money men, elitists and folks who are pushing around big amounts of money and investing in things. And he was always accused of being corrupt. As far as I can tell, as far as him financially benefiting from anything that he did, I don't think so. Mostly because I just looked at his, what I could find of his, record books and his budget and what he was spending on things and the state of his finances when he died. He was seemingly not making money off what he was doing. And he talks a lot in his letters about if anyone's going to look for someone to do something strange or corrupt, it's going to be the Secretary of the Treasury, right? So there's no way that I would even think about doing something like that. So, okay, he's not a corrupt person. That said, there was a lot of corruption happening around him, right? There were wealthy people trying to figure out what to invest in or what not to invest in by trying to get a sense from him as to what he was going to do. I remember reading an account of him at a dinner party and people asking questions and then watching the expression on his face to judge maybe their investment strategy. Really couldn't have been fun to be Hamilton in that situation. But at any rate, there were a lot of people making a lot of money, wealthy people, elite people, people who were more likely, many of them, to be Federalists, to be of Hamilton's political persuasion, making a lot of money off of what he was doing. So there was certainly a swirling haze of questions surrounding some of what he was doing. Now, there's a story, and as I was preparing my comments this morning, I was like, oh, I'll tell this story, the corruption story. And then as I made my notes about it, I thought, oh, it feels so different now than ever before. And you'll see what I mean when I tell it. So it's a story that I believe Thomas Jefferson tells. And I think if I remember correctly, he tells it more than once. He tells Hamilton stories multiple times. In his old age, when he's trying to talk about what happened in the past, there's a handful of Hamilton stories that two or three of them that he says more than once, because it's like, that shows who he is. So in this case, it's a story of a dinner at Jefferson's house during the first, Washington's administration, when Jefferson was there. And I guess John Adams was there, and Hamilton was there, and Jefferson was there. And Adams says something like, strip away its corruption, and the British government would be the finest government on the face of the earth. And Hamilton says, oh no, with its corruption, it's the finest nation on the face of the earth. And he explains, what he means by that is the wheeling and dealing behind the scenes that runs the wheels of government, right? Everything can't be upfront and proper. There has to be a certain amount of wheeling and dealing, corruption for things to go. Now, that's very Hamiltonian. He's not an idealist at all about human nature, right? He very much thinks, and in the letter that we started this entire enterprise of History Matters with, I talked about contingency and Hamilton thinking the whole experiment was probably going to fall apart. He had a very pragmatic and maybe almost dark view of human nature and felt that big government structures needed to be in place because human passions, which there were always going to be some bad human passions, needed to be channeled in a useful direction. So him saying corruption has its uses, corruption actually helps government go, that's in the sort of in sync with some of what he thinks, but he's also saying some degree of corruption is necessary in all governments. And when I was writing that this morning, I just had to pause. There are so many things I think about as a historian, particularly about the founding, that I will never think of in the same way again. And this became one of them this morning. Okay. My point here with Hamilton is obviously history is complicated, people are complicated, the complications really matter because in the end, it's the complications joined with the more positive things that are shaping what gets done. And you can't understand what gets done unless you try to include the whole picture. There is no perfect moment in time and there is no perfect person. And if you create those people, by definition, you're warping the past. Okay, so that's Hamilton. Let me move on to talk a little bit about the play. So people always ask me, and particularly when it first came out, what do you think of the play? And I think they want me to say, or the way they ask it is, or at least originally way back, I think they wanted me to say, well, I'm a historian, so I really don't like it because it gets so many things wrong. And there are many things that are wrong. I'm not going to go fact by fact and mention them, but there are facts that are wrong and there are things that are missing, and I'm going to come back to that idea. As theater, I think it's brilliant. As a theatrical experience, as a musical, I think it's brilliant. And it does a lot of things that I think a lot of people didn't know musical theater could do. I also think that, granted, there's a lot missing. Come right back to that. But there's so much history in that show, just on a basic level, that, they sing George Washington's farewell address. The first time I saw it at the Public Theater, there was a high school history teacher sitting near me, and I know that because at intermission, we exchanged a few words, and she was crying because they were singing Washington's farewell address, and she couldn't quite believe that history was on the stage in that way with that kind of respect, right? They sing about the assumption of state debts. They sing about the National Bank. I mean, really, the first time I saw the play, I probably spent a lot of it going, like, how is that in there? So there's a lot of history in it. I think the play led a lot of people to understand that history isn't just a bunch of dates. How important is that? And I know there are a lot of teachers of history of various sorts following me and here this morning, and that's huge, right? And the play got people interested, like passionately interested in history, particularly early American history, which doesn't always grab passions, in a way that I've never seen before and which is important. And I think the play does two things, which I don't know if they seem minor, but are easy to overlook, but I think that are important. One of them is it humanizes the founding and the founders. And even though Hamilton is a little bit idealized, the play does drive home for people that these are real people. And that sounds like a goofy statement, but we don't many people don't think of the founders that way, right? They see them as these, marble statues on a pedestal, and that they're perfect and that they created a perfect thing, and that no, right? And you really can't understand our history if you think that's what it started with. It started as a very flawed human effort from the beginning, and that our story is working with that or against it or for it, but in one way or another, that's the starting point. So by humanizing the period, that's an important point. And the other important point that I think that the play does really well is it drives home contingency, right? And I love the fact, when I was thinking this morning about what I was going to say, I thought we started with Hamilton and contingency. The first History Matters conversation we had was why contingency is important, and a Hamilton document that shows that. So I kind of love the fact that as that musical is about to air on TV, we're coming back to contingency in Hamilton, but the play does that really well, right? You watch the play and you don't think, well, revolution, we all know how that's going to turn out, right? You get a sense of things in the making and the tension and risks involved, and that nothing was guaranteed. And that's, I've said it before, I did say it on that first day, that's like front and center in understanding history, is that fundamental understanding. So I think the play does that well too. Obviously, there's a lot missing. And particularly right now, and I'm very curious to see how this is going to play out. On the one hand, it is showing the importance of revolution and protest. On the other hand, the question of race and slavery, it's mentioned a little bit in the play, but it's really not addressed. And it's musical theater, so I always feel a little bit conflicted, but it's musical theater that has a real power, this particular play. And it is true that slavery was the sort of grounding foundation of what was going on in that time period. The structures were grounded on it, economies were grounded on it. And to tell a story without it really being there is a problem. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. It also doesn't really, for as much as it sings about the National Bank and Hamilton's financial plan, there really aren't there's not a lot of politics in there, like real politics, Hamilton's politics. I wrote an article, I'll give the link to that. I think it might be in a journal. Oh no, but it might be open now. Okay, anyway, I'll figure it out. But I wrote an article titled, "Can we get back to politics, please?" Which is a line from the play, but talks about what's missing. And it also tells a story which is mostly dead white guys. They don't happen to be white, they're definitely not dead, but it's the same, 8 guys that we tell our founding story with. So that's a problem too. Now, my response to that is I agree with all of that. And in my teaching of history, I don't want people to come away with any of that. I don't want them to think 8 guys in a room created the nation. I don't want them to not know the foundational importance of slavery. But to me, the play is an opportunity to teach those ideas by teaching against it, right? People are so, especially students, are so passionate about that play. What an opportunity to say, I know you love the play, it does a lot of things well. Let's talk about what isn't there. Let's talk about what's missing. Let's talk about the real story. Students are much more open to that, I think, with this kind of starting point where they've been drawn in on their own account. So to me, this is a prime teaching moment because it makes these messages about what's missing that much more important, that much more obvious, that generally speaking, in our telling of our own story, we often don't include these things, and they need to be included. So in a sense, it's a piece of musical theater, it's a piece of art. It can't include everything in it, but by not including some pretty key things, it forces us to have a conversation that needs to be had, and I think that's an important thing. Okay, which brings me to the last point, and then I really do want to open things up. As I said at the outset, there's a reason why story, the word story is in the word history, right? History, in a sense, is the story we create about ourselves, right? It is the stories that we tell of our past. There isn't only one. That sometimes is a problem, but history, in a sense, is a narrative of the past that, in one way or another, leads to the present. Sometimes that narrative is created with a pretty deliberate purpose in mind, an agenda. Sometimes it's just, there isn't as much of an obvious agenda, but the history that we're telling is very obviously shaped by who we are, who the storyteller is, and what time period they're living in, and what's happening in that moment. One way or another, it's a narrative. And by narrative, I don't mean false and full of lies. Some narratives are false and full of lies, but what I mean is we create stories of the past. All of us do that, right? And historians anchor their stories with evidence that they find with really thorough research, but they're still constructing some kind of a narrative understanding in one way or another, or contributing to a narrative understanding. What that does is, you know, if you've created a story, it gets a sort of momentum of its own, and what's not in that story just doesn't get noticed, right? So, and I think people of all kinds strip away the complexity of the stories that we tell about ourselves, right? Strip away the sort of complexity that I've been talking about in the case of the play in Hamilton. Make it see history as a simple story, a story of these people were doing this thing in this way, and this was the outcome, and you can fill in the blanks. But I think, you know, I think that's what some people have done with Hamilton. I think that, in a sense, that's what the play does. Again, I don't throw darts at it because it's musical theater. But, you know, think about when the play first opened on Broadway. The reaction, I tried to write an op-ed about this and nobody would take it. Which really frustrated me. The point of the op-ed was there was a really fascinating response to the play at its opening. On the one hand, you had more liberal people saying it's an immigrant story of an immigrant who raised himself up by his bootstraps, right? And then you had more conservative people saying founders, it's celebrating the founders. And both of those things were happening at the same time. And that's a prime example of the way in which we craft stories and attach ourselves to stories. And there are different stories that can be told. Some are more grounded in evidence than others, but still, that was fascinating to me. And in both cases, that narrative, you know, it isn't fully right. Obviously, history is not just the founders. And as far as an immigrant who raised himself up by his bootstraps, yeah. But, you know, would I say he raised himself up by his bootstraps? I would partly, but he also was really good at, in essence, and this is going to sound shadier than I mean it to, playing the system. And by that, I mean, the way to get ahead in that world was to impress important people, right? If you were no one and you came from nowhere, if you could impress important people, they could help, you know, kind of noblesse oblige. They could help elevate you. Hamilton was really good at that. And he went through his life doing that. And I don't think it was like, like now I'll get him and he'll advance me. But I do think he knew fundamentally, if I get to an important person and I press my ideas with that person and they like them, that's going to get me somewhere. So yeah, he raised himself up by his bootstraps, but it was part of a system that wasn't about bootstraps. So my point is, we tend to strip history of its complexity. And I think a great example of that, you know, and I don't necessarily want to talk about this very much, but it's, you know, right in front of us, the statue controversy that we're going through right now, right? Talk about stripping things of their complexity. A piece of concrete standing someplace does not represent history, right? It's testimony to the people who put it up. So that's a kind of history, right? The people who put it up had a motive in mind. They put it in a certain place for a certain reason. They were including or excluding certain people or certain ideas. All of that is valuable. But a block of marble, in the same way that the founders weren't blocks of marble, and calling them that strips away the significance and meaning of what they're doing and the holes within it. The statues, it's the same thing, right? That's a statue is a simplified version of history. And so, you know, I know it's silly almost to say that if you take down a statue, history doesn't get erased, but I feel the need to say it because, and this is the reason, they're not telling history. The only way to tell history is to do far more than a statue does. So in a sense, the statue almost does an injustice to these figures by not showing them really as in the struggle of their time, for better and worse, what they were doing and what it means. That's a better way of telling history. And so I think I'm going to end with this point. I think one of the themes, I guess I'm driving around here this morning, is the real challenge for us in understanding our history and confronting our history is owning the ugliness, owning the flaws, owning the mistakes, owning the things that, looking back, we know were wrong and shouldn't have happened. And that's part of our story. And you can't tell our story without them being there, because they're part of who we are. And we are in the moment that we are in because all of those things shaped our getting here. And so the complexity of history is the only way really to confront and understand the present, right? We have to own the ugliness. That doesn't mean that that ideals don't matter, even if they haven't yet been reached. Ideals have been used in the past for people to push themselves forward, to bring themselves out of some of the things that are holding them back. That's important. But I don't think you can pontificate about the ideals without owning the fact that there was all of this ugliness there in addition. And the American story is reckoning with both, right? The ugliness is there. We are where we are because of the blend of the good and the bad in the past. And you can't say historians who talk about the bad are somehow downplay, denouncing America. No, they're actually saying, I love this country enough that I want to really understand how it worked, what happened, and how we got here. To really understand and love your country, I think you have to see it as it is and not as you want it to be. Okay, that is my soapbox. I am going to mention two things, and then I'm not going to forget the mug this week. For those who are new, so far, this is week 13. Every week I have a coffee mug, since this is History Matters, and so does coffee. A mug that is thematically tied to the topic. And I'll come to this in a moment, but this might be the last mug I can do this with. I think I've run out of mugs, but this one is definitely linked. But before I get to that, I do want to mention that, and I said it at the outset, some of you might not have heard, but there's this thing called Historians at the Movies, hashtag HATM on Twitter. And they, I guess weekly on Sundays at usually 8 o'clock, a bunch of historians and then a bunch of just people generally who want to watch a movie get together, watch a movie that has some historical content, and then live tweet about it as they watch it. And it's incredibly interesting and fun, and the historians weigh in, and it's great. So I mention that only because tomorrow, HATM, Historians at the Movies, is going to be watching Hamilton together beginning at 7 o'clock. So it's going to be in sync with the real watching of Hamilton, which is the people who made it. But this way people won't have to choose. They can just bounce back and forth all they want. And I'm going to be smack at the center live tweeting, right? I'm actually tomorrow afternoon going to work at being sure I've got my tweets lined up. So anyway, those of you who want to join, if you're just on Twitter at 7 o'clock, you can bounce back and forth between the real people who are talking about the actual play and then me bouncing history off of it. At any rate, I mentioned that 7 o'clock tomorrow. What else? I think that's all. Matt said where it is, but I think that's the only thing. Hashtag HATM will be the way to find it. Okay, the mug. I remembered the mug this week, and I remembered it. Oops, it actually has like lipstick all over it. I remembered it because it's a little bit goofy, but a student gave it to me, and for that reason, I love it.
Oh, that's lovely.
How perfect is that, right?
That is perfect.
I picked, for those, I don't know if you all can see it. In my previous life, I was Alexander Hamilton. Who knew that this mug existed? A student gave it to me Um, and I love it for that reason. And also because, right, mug perfection, it truly is. Okay.
I thought I was being clever with the musical notes one.
Oh, but that's good.
I was trying to be clever, and you can't outdo what you did. I mean, your mug is
It might be my mug peak. I don't know. But at any rate, I'm gonna shut up because I've talked a really lot today because it was important things we were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
But now I want folks to be able to ask questions as we always do. So
questions away. And just as a reminder to folks, put your questions in Q&A. That way I will actually see them because chat is sort of half covered up at the moment. And as always, if you don't have questions, you're stuck with my questions. So, and nobody, if you ask any of my students, my questions are the less fun questions in the world. So. Lois asked this, and she asks, can you speak to if Hamilton had a relationship with Governor Morris?
Oh, okay, right.
She has a Governor Morris crush.
Oh, okay. Well, that frames the question in a different way. Okay. Yes. So I think I don't know if it's governor or governor, G-O-U.
Governor. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I actually don't. I always that's me deciding that's how it's pronounced. They were friends, and they Gouverneur Morris was I think New Jersey or New York, I think, Federalist. He had the same politics as Hamilton. He took part in the Constitutional Convention, and he was friends with Hamilton. They knew each other from the war. I always call him in my classes. I tell you guys all these wacky things. I call him the Goov because he had a wacky sense of humor. He actually also, I should say, he had one leg and a peg leg, which sometimes the New York Historical Society displays, which I discovered by seeing it and going, oh, it's a piece of Gouverneur Morris. But at any rate, he had very similar politics, maybe even more conservative than Hamilton's politics, but they were friends and they had the same sense of humor, and they would goad each other into saying things they shouldn't say. So there's a famous story, might not be true, but it's very in character, that there was some kind of a reception or a party, and Morris was there and Hamilton was there and Washington was there, and Morris said to Hamilton, oh no, Hamilton said to Morris, I'm sorry, I dare you to go up there and pat him on the back and say, good to see you, General, I dare you. And because he's kind of, Washington is a forbidding character. So Morris supposedly does it and is not thrilled at the look he gets in response, and comes back to Hamilton and says, yeah, I did it. I'm not ever gonna do that again. That's very in character for the two of them. If you look at their letters during the war, they're always like making bets. I think one of them bets a beaver hat that the other one won't do something. Anyway, they have an interesting relationship. And Morris is he has a real sense of humor. One of my friends calls him the one-legged comedian from the Bronx. So yes, New York. At any rate, he's an interesting character, but he is very conservative in his politics. He has a lot to say about the French Revolution. And there's a very old edition of his diary that was published in the 19th century, I think by a descendant. So if you're interested in that stuff, I'm assuming that it might even be online, like at Google Books. I haven't checked, but that would be one way to kind of see what he's thinking in addition to finding biographies.
Excellent. Okay, so I don't know if you can answer this question, but it's a good question, so I'm gonna put it out there, which is, could you speak to the quarantines endured by Hamilton family and how we might learn from that in our present situation, or any of the literal quarantines that?
Yeah, well, the yellow fever, right? Yeah. There's a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. It's bad. A lot of people leave town. Hamilton probably got it. People were saying that he got it. He was really sick. What's interesting is, actually, particularly in this moment, that's an interesting question. He ultimately, when he was beginning to feel a little better. So first off, before I get to that, there were two main theories about how to treat the yellow fever. And there was a Federalist way to treat the yellow fever and a Republican way to treat the yellow
Really?
fever. It was a polarized response to an epidemic. And
That sounds familiar.
yeah, I know. I should write about that. I didn't think about that till this moment. So anyway, Hamilton got the Federalist cure. I don't know if one was necessarily better than the other. I think Benjamin Rush was the chief in the Republican cure, which involved a lot of bleeding. Edward Stevens, who's Hamilton's friend from boyhood, was the Federalist cure guy, and I think there was a lot of cold bathing involved. I don't know all of the detail, but at any rate, polarized. Then Hamilton begins to feel better, and he and his family want to leave Philadelphia. This is a problem because New York doesn't want him back. Because they're coming from yellow fever land, right? So New York, oh man, this is such a good question. New York says, isn't happy with the Hamiltons coming back into New York, given that the problem is in Pennsylvania. And if I remember correctly, the Hamiltons have to burn their clothes and like have to do really extreme things to prove that they're not, infected with the disease to allow themselves to come back into New York. So, if the question is, what can we learn? Some of what we're learning is, wow, epidemics can be, during polarized times, really polarizing experiences. And there's also maybe a small toolbox of ways in which you can confront that state by state, and that's an ongoing problem too. But yeah, that, and actually one last thing, should I do this? Yeah, I don't want to smack at Thomas Jefferson, but there is a sort of snarky, it would have been a snarky tweet. Jefferson writes, I think, to Madison and says, Hamilton, supposedly this really brave guy, is said to have the fever, and he's like calling 1,000 doctors to his house. It's kind of a snarky, like, what a, I'm not going to say snowflake, but that's the implication. Anyway, okay, I'm really talking a lot today. Well, it's Hamilton. What can I say?
Yes. And you have extra strong coffee, as we talked about.
I do. Yeah.
Carolyn wants to know, what would you say was Hamilton's greatest political flaw?
Greatest political flaw. Wow. Well, I can think of one could answer that in many ways. One way to answer it would be he was impulsive and opinionated and did not play well with others. So if you're talking about being a politician, which they might not have used that word in the way we use it now, but someone in political life who's making their career that way, that's not a guy who's necessarily going to do really well in politics. He was a force to be reckoned with. And the fact that he was a plan maker for most of his life. There are many reasons why he succeeded in what he did. He tended to issue marching orders to the people who worked with him. That's a serious flaw. And wrapped up in that is impulsive and has very strong ideas and does and says things he should not say, not just personally, but politically. There's not a lot of filter there, and that can be a problem. All of these things make him his own worst enemy, in a sense, as far as his politics are concerned. One could say that at the time, people would have said, well, he's kind of a monarchist, right? That he really wanted a stronger central government. Did he want a king per se? No. But did he want the president to be as powerful as he could possibly make the president be? Yeah. At the time, people who agreed with him did not consider that a flaw. Looking back now, we might say, well, that's a strong view. He had other strong views, that we wouldn't love. He liked to call in the military on civil unrest. That is not a lovely thing. So, there are aspects of his politics that are problematic. But if you wanted me to put my finger on one, I think I would say that in his political method, that actually, as much as people think he's a crafty guy, in some ways he was not a good politician.
Interesting. Tim wants wants you to talk a little bit more about Hamilton's status as an immigrant. Was immigration status a salient identity in Hamilton's day? How did his identity as an immigrant impact his life and politics?
Well, one thing to remember about his day is that people were bouncing all over the British Empire. You know, like there were people born in Scotland and people born in Ireland and people born in England. And, you know, there would have been a really interesting mix of accents if you were hanging out with people in the United States at that time. So it's not as though everyone was like, you know, we are all from America, and then Hamilton like beams in from outer space. There were a lot of people around, and including founder folk from other parts of the British Empire. So in that sense, it's not as we consider it today, but his coming from the Caribbean, people took note of that. You know, when they talk about him, like there's a letter I saw 1,000 years ago from someone who met him when he was in Washington's aide in the army. And it just says something like, you know, I met a Colonel Hamilton today, he's a West Indian, right? Which means that was the thing this person picked up on, which is interesting. So I think that, among other things, shaped his politics because he wasn't attached to any one state, right? So he is someone anyway who is a powerful national government guy, but he didn't have the sort of lifelong attachment to a state in the way that most people did. And so if you're talking about a nationalizing message, that helps, that facilitates, you know, him being able to think about things that way. You know, let's chop up the states and make them all equal in size is not something anyone from any state would really say. And, you know, he's toying with that idea. I would say that what he would say was more significant was his illegitimate birth. That people snark about behind the scenes. You know, Adams calls him the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. In the late 1790s, when there's really a lot of polarization, hyper-polarization between Federalists and Republicans, people start trotting that out about him to kind of smack at him and his cause. And he actually writes a letter that says something like, it's mortifying, all these people are talking about my origin, so I'm just going to state it here. And it's the only place, really. He lays out a very condensed version of why his parents weren't married, which might or might not be true, I don't know, and what happened in his youth. But that base-born or low-born, the fact that he came from nowhere, he was from the Caribbean, which not as many people were, he was illegitimate. People at the time would have called him, and this is a phrase I love, a mushroom gentleman. And what that means is, mushrooms sprout up out of nowhere and don't have roots, right? They're like, you don't like them. They're a little ucky, you know, and they come in these dark, damp places and appear. So a mushroom gentleman is someone who appears out of nowhere and has no roots and is thus a little nasty, right? So Hamilton would have been an example of a mushroom gentleman. I give you that phrase because it's just so good.
That's a good phrase.
Isn't it? It's wonderful. At any rate, all of those things, I think, were more present for him as immediate problems.
It occurs to me then that when Lin-Manuel Miranda started the play with the line, how does a bastard orphan son of a horde of Scott? He really nails sort of the fundamental identity values of how Hamilton thought of himself, or what people thought of Hamilton at the time.
Things that people would have thought about him. Now, what I always find funny about that is very often, particularly when the play first came out and I was doing radio shows and things, podcasts, people would say, what do you think? Actually, I was just asked this recently on Twitter. What do you think Hamilton would have thought of the musical? And my immediate response is, oh my gosh, I mean, they're singing about his origins, his
right.
Lowly origins. This would not thrill him. This would really not thrill him. The other thing I said, which I think is also, valid and not obvious, he kind of prided himself on doing things that made him unpopular, because that meant he was doing things for reasons that he considered to be virtuous and not to gain popularity, right? He wasn't a demagogue. People didn't like him, and that showed that he was really doing things because he believed in them. I don't think he would love being Mr. Popular. I don't think he would trust the wild love being thrown at him, and I don't know if he would quite know what to do with it, because that popularity of that sort is not something that he, equated with himself. And there's even a moment when he's considered to be sent to England to negotiate what becomes the Jay Treaty. So John Jay is sent, and Hamilton says, essentially in a letter to Washington, I'm not the best guy for that because I'm really not popular, and that will make it controversial. So he knows that. So again, more complexity. More complexity. I'll stop.
Couple more, and we'll call it a day if that's okay. And then we'll.
Yeah, I know we went over, guys.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. This is a good topic, and so Andy asks a good question. I don't know if you can answer it, but so Jefferson knew about the Reynolds affair. Did Hamilton know about Jefferson and Hemmings?
Good question. Well, ultimately, he would have, because it becomes public.
Right.
James Callender. As far as before that, there's no evidence. And I don't think there's any mention of it that I could think of in Hamilton's papers. There's a mention of the Reynolds affairs. One in Jefferson has a memo that's not, it's a little coded, and it just says something like the affair of H and R, or like it's clear that he was told about it, I think by James Monroe, but that's all he says. So I don't know if he knew, but if he did, he wasn't writing about it. So I don't know.
Right, so we have no evidence of it, yeah.
Not that I can remember.
Tom wants to know, what was it like shooting a dueling pistol?
Oh, yes. Okay, so for those who don't know, I did indeed shoot a dueling pistol. A friend of mine arranged for me to go to a police firing range with the full permission of the police and shoot a black powder dueling pistol. What was interesting, I've never shot a gun before, so that was the first time I shot a gun. And the people who were preparing me for this were like, it's gonna be scary, just, be brave because this is gonna be scary. And it wasn't. It was far scarier after I shot the dueling pistol. I shot a real gun, and that was far scarier than the dueling pistol. The dueling pistol was an interesting sensory experience because, first of all, it's heavy. So it was very hard, front heavy. So it was hard to hold it up. I don't have the strongest wrists, so, I don't know what that means for anybody else, but at any rate, it was hard to hold up, it was heavy. And when you fired it, it had this very satisfying click, flash, boom, and then the smoke would come. So the process of shooting it was there, and you heard it, and you smelled it, and you felt it. There was not a lot of kickback. It was very, it was not accurate, and I learned that from the police officer who was shooting it, and he was a marksman, and he did not know where the heck the ball from the pistol went, and we would go look for it. But shooting it was really interesting, and that's exactly what it was. Click, flash, boom, and then the smoke. Does that ever appear in anything I've ever written? Not really, but I'm glad I had the experience of doing it. It sort of adds something in your gut when you're writing about dueling to have that kind of feeling.
So one last question, then we'll say goodbye to our recorded and Facebook folks. What was your favorite song from the musical? And
okay, there's two answers.
Okay.
I love Satisfied because the rewind thing is so brilliant. I think that's an amazing song.
And it's staged impeccably.
Yeah.
The staging of the rewind is unbelievable.
For those of you who haven't seen it, just that moment. And when you see it, it's very different from what you hear. Mm-hmm. When you just listen to the music. I have to be biased and say 10 Dual Commandments also, because it's partly based on my work. So, one of the lyrics comes from a document I found at the New York Historical Society. Lin-Manuel Miranda told me at one point that, yeah, he had read my work and that it was based on it. So I gotta have loyalty to 10 Dual Commandments. but I love Satisfied. I love the play, I do, but Satisfied is pretty amazing.
That is it's fantastic. It's a great way to end for the day. So,
Indeed.
so thank you. I'm going to end our recording. But before everybody goes away, or those of you who are hanging out with us, because we do tend to hang out for a few minutes after, and I'm going to just turn off your spotlight so I can say this one rather important thing. If I can find it. There it is. Okay. So one, I do want to let everybody know, if you do follow us here at the NCHE, we are going to be hosting a summit on race and equity August 4th, 5th, and 6th, and we'll have a series of webinars leading up to that. So please join us for that. It's going to be an amazing event. With everything going on in the world, we want to have an opportunity to speak with experts in history and in history education. And so look for registration and a full lineup of folks on that at our website, www.nche.net. And we will be highlighting that. It's going to be an amazing event. So please come to that. And thank you, Joanne, for a wonderful day.
Thank everybody for coming. We are going to have the after party now. We're going to stick around. So if you want to stick around, we don't record it, so I could be a little bit freer. But at any rate, yeah, we're going to stick around for a little while at the after party if you would like to. And in the meantime, until next week, thank you all for coming and for remaining committed to good history.